In this presentation, I will cover anatomy and physiology of the brain and the spinal cord. From anatomical point of view, nervous system is divided into central nervous system and peripheral nervous system. Central nervous system is composed of brain and spinal cord, whereas peripheral nervous system is composed of nervous tissue outside of the central nervous system. And in this video, I am only focusing on the central nervous system. Brain is divided into four major regions: cerebrum, diencephalon, cerebellum, and brain stem. Here you see cerebrum cross-section, side view, and front view to get better understanding of its anatomy. The cerebrum is covered by a continuous layer of wrinkled gray matter, also known as cerebral cortex. The ridges of those wrinkles are called gyri, and grooves between two gyri are called sulci. Because the head is limited by the size of the birth canal and the brain must fit inside of the cranial cavity of the skull, extensive folding of the cerebral cortex enables more gray matter to fit into this limited space. Otherwise, your brain would equal to 1 square meter. Right underneath the gray matter, there is white matter. White matter gets its name because it contains relatively few cell bodies and is mainly composed of long-range myelinated axons, whereas gray matter contains numerous cell bodies and relatively few myelinated axons. So as you see, the color difference in the white and gray matter arises mainly from the whiteness of the myelin. Cerebrum is divided into right cerebral hemisphere and left cerebral hemisphere. And the separation between two sides is called longitudinal fissure. The two halves communicate through structure inside of the cerebrum called corpus callosum. Neurological functions such as memory, emotion, and consciousness are the result of cerebral function. Further, the cortex can be separated into four major lobes: the frontal lobe, which is primarily associated with motor functions or muscle movement in other words; the parietal lobe, which is associated with somatosensation such as touch, pressure, tickle, pain, itch, vibrations, sense of body position and movement; the occipital lobe, which is responsible for primary visual perception; and the temporal lobe, which is associated with primary auditory sensation and memory. Lobes are separated by grooves on the surface of the brain referred to as sulcus. Central sulcus, for example, separates frontal lobe and parietal lobe. Parieto-occipital sulcus separates parietal lobe and occipital lobe. And lateral sulcus separates temporal lobe from the other regions. The diencephalon is deep beneath the cerebrum and constitutes the walls of the third ventricle. Its function is to allow information flow between spinal cord and brain, as well as peripheral nervous system and brain. Exception is the system associated with olfaction, which connects directly with the cerebrum. Diencephalon is composed of thalamus, which is a collection of nuclei that relay information between cerebral cortex and periphery, brainstem, and spinal cord. All sensory information except for the sense of smell passes through the thalamus before processing by the cortex. Response to the sensory information is then passed from cerebrum down to the thalamus, which usually communicates motor commands. The thalamus does not just pass the information on, it also processes that information. For example, portion of the thalamus that receives visual information will influence what visual stimuli are important or what receives the attention. Hypothalamus is the collection of nuclei that are largely involved in regulating homeostasis. The hypothalamus is the executive area in charge of autonomic nervous system and endocrine system through its regulation of the pituitary gland. Other parts of the hypothalamus are involved in memory and emotion. Epithalamus contains pineal glands which secrete melatonin and help regulate circadian rhythm. Lastly, pituitary gland produces and secretes various types of hormones. The brainstem is divided into midbrain, which coordinates sensory representations of visual, auditory, and somatosensory perceptual spaces, and hindbrain, which is composed of pons and medulla, regulating several crucial functions such as cardiovascular and respiratory system rates. The cerebellum, as the name suggests, is the small brain. It is covered with gray matter containing gyri and sulci, and right underneath there is white matter. It looks like a miniature version of the cerebrum. Cerebellum receives copy of the sensory information as it travels from the peripheral nervous system to the cerebrum. Cerebellum also receives copy of the motor information as it travels from the cerebrum to the periphery. Cerebellum is also largely responsible for comparing the information that it receives. One of the medical conditions associated with brain injury is called stroke. Stroke occurs when blood supply to a part of brain is interrupted or reduced, depriving brain tissue from oxygen and nutrients such as glucose. The blood flow blockage can be caused by blood clot, fat, or air bubble. Brain cells begin to die in minutes and neurological function is compromised. Strokes will often result in loss of very specific functions. For example, stroke in lateral medulla can cause loss of the ability to swallow. Therefore, immediate help and treatment is required as soon as possible to reduce damage being done to the brain tissue. Stroke symptoms include trouble speaking and understanding what others are saying, paralysis or numbness of the face, arm, leg, and trouble walking. You or someone who is experiencing stroke might not be able to lift both or one arm above the head, and one side of the mouth may droop when trying to smile. Problems seeing with one or both eyes and headaches are also associated with stroke. Again, it is important to recognize these symptoms and reach out for immediate help. Spinal cord is another major part of the central nervous system that conducts sensory information from the peripheral nervous system to the brain and motor information from the brain to the peripheral nervous system, particularly muscular and glandular tissue. The length of the spinal cord is divided into areas that correspond to different regions of the vertebral column. For example, the region of spinal cord immediately adjacent to the brainstem is called cervical region. Then there is thoracic, lumbar, sacral, and coccyx region. The nerves that emerge from the spinal cord pass through the intervertebral foramina of the vertebral column at the respective levels. Now keep in mind that the spinal cord is not the full length of the vertebral column because spinal cord does not grow significantly longer after the first or second year, but the skeleton continues to grow. As the vertebral column grows, these nerves grow with it and result in a long bundle of nerves that resemble horsetail that is named cauda equina. When you look at the cross-section of the spinal cord, the gray matter is located in the middle and it appears in the shape of a butterfly or capital letter H depending on your imagination. The gray matter is subdivided into regions called horns. The posterior horns, through which sensory signals enter the spinal cord, the anterior horns, through which motor signals leave the spinal cord. The lateral horns are only found in the thoracic, upper lumbar, and sacral regions, and it is the major component of the sympathetic division of the autonomic nervous system. Around the gray matter, you will find white matter, which is subdivided into regions called columns. Posterior columns are located in between two posterior horns of the gray matter. Anterior columns are located in between two anterior horns of the gray matter, and lateral columns are located on each side of the spinal cord in between posterior and anterior horn of the gray matter. Posterior midline of the spinal cord is called posterior median sulcus, whereas anterior midline is called anterior median fissure. In the middle of the spinal cord, you will find central canal filled with cerebrospinal fluid. Now let's take a look at the flow of information between peripheral nervous system and the central nervous system. Sensory information travels from the periphery through the posterior nerve root, posterior horn, and posterior, anterior, and lateral column before it gets to the brain. Whereas motor information travels from the brain through the anterior and lateral columns, anterior horn, and anterior nerve root before it gets to the periphery. Brain and spinal cord are protected from mechanical and physical injuries by various protective components. Specifically, brain is protected by tough cranial bones of the skull, whereas spinal cord is protected by tough vertebral bones forming vertebral column, also known as spinal column or spine. It consists of a sequence of vertebrae, each separated and united by intervertebral discs. Further, brain and spinal cord are covered by a series of protective membranes called meninges. Dura mater is the outermost protective membrane attached to the inner surface of cranial bones and vertebral column. It is composed of thick fibrous layer of connective tissue covering brain, spinal cord, and major blood vessels that enter the central nervous system. Arachnoid matter is right underneath dura mater, so it is the middle protective membrane composed of thin fibrous tissue that forms loose sac around brain and spinal cord. Right underneath there is subarachnoid space composed of filamentous mesh called arachnoid trabeculae, which looks like a spider web. This space is filled with cerebrospinal fluid, which provides liquid cushioning to the brain and spinal cord. Pia mater is the innermost protective membrane directly adjacent to the surface of the brain and spinal cord, composed of thin fibrous membrane. An example of medical condition affecting meninges is called meningitis, which is an inflammation of meninges and can be caused by viral, bacterial, or fungal infection. Symptoms are associated with fever, chills, nausea, vomiting, light sensitivity, soreness of neck or severe headache, and confusion. Hearing loss is a common result of meningitis if not treated. The primary test for meningitis is called lumbar puncture, where needle is inserted into lumbar region of the spinal column through the dura mater and arachnoid membrane into the subarachnoid space to withdraw cerebrospinal fluid for chemical testing. Cerebrospinal fluid is yet another example of protective component of the central nervous system. It is produced from components extracted from the blood by choroid plexus in 4 ventricles of the brain, specifically the left and right lateral ventricle, 3rd ventricle, and 4th ventricle. It then flows through subarachnoid space around all of the central nervous system, providing 2 important functions. It picks up metabolic wastes from the nervous tissue and is then reabsorbed into blood along with the metabolic wastes. This blood is then filtered out by the kidneys. It also acts as a liquid cushioning for the brain and the spinal cord. This is the end of my presentation on brain and spinal cord. Please subscribe if you find my videos helpful and educational.